Night along the Nile. The water is black, but not empty. It carries a single strip of moonlight the way a quiet hand carries a thin blade, carefully without spilling it. Reeds lean and whisper to one another at the edge of the current. In the distance, the desert rests like a sleeping animal, vast and still, holding its breath as if the smallest sound might wake something ancient. But listen, what if the Nile didn't return? No flood, no black soil, no harvest. Would there have been an Egypt at all? On the shore, a doorway glows. One oil lamp trembles there, its flame uncertain in the night air, as though it has been left not only to light a room, but to guard a secret older than memory. The mud brick walls around it drink in the darkness. The sky above is open and heavy with stars, and the river moves beneath them as it has always moved. Patient, unhurried, sure of its way. Egypt's story cannot be separated from this rhythm. Not from the rivers returning. Not from the slow, dependable pulse of flood, silt and harvest. Water rising, water receding, the land darkening with fresh soil, then greening again. Year after year, the Nile brought the conditions for dense life in a narrow corridor of fertile ground, pressed between desert and sky. It was not only a source of drinking water, not only a road, not only a boundary. It was a calendar written in motion and a promise that the world could begin again. And when we say ancient Egypt, we're speaking of something long, longer than most kingdoms, longer than most memories. Not a single moment held still in time, but a span of millennia with shifting capitals and dynasties, with changing names and identities. It is less like one kingdom with one face, and more like a river itself, sometimes narrow, sometimes wide, sometimes broken into channels, sometimes gathered into a single current again. Always moving forward, even when it seems to repeat itself. Yet what reaches us from that long current is uneven. We inherit the stone, we inherit the monuments that resisted weather and theft. We inherit the elite tombs cut into rock, the temple walls covered in sacred words. We inherit inscriptions that were meant to last, meant to endure. And because those things survive, they shape our view, quietly, powerfully. The lives of ordinary people were often written on materials that decay, or not written at all. Their voices were spoken into air and carried off by wind. Their stories lived in hands and routines, in meals and arguments, in births and losses, and then faded. Some historians suggest that this imbalance, the survival of stone over reed and ink, creates a kind of echo. We hear the loudest voices first. Kings, priests, officials. We see the grandest buildings. We follow the most carefully preserved names. And still, beneath that, there is the murmur of a larger world that we cannot fully retrieve. It's tempting to wonder in a night like this what the civilization would sound like if it could speak in its own night voice. Would it be hymns drifting from a temple, steady and formal, rising and falling like breath among columns? Or would it be quieter than that? Footsteps in a mud brick courtyard at dawn, a child's cough, a door bar sliding into place, the soft scrape of a pot set on a hearth. Would it be the river itself, speaking in the language of current and reed and silt? Imagine, then, a boatman in the dark. He sits low in the hull, feeling the shape of the water through wood. He knows the river the way others know roads. He listens for the small changes, the shift in current, the sound of reeds, the scent of shoreline mud. Above him, stars hold their positions. Along the bank, familiar silhouettes of palms and distant structures guide him. In this darkness, the Nile is not frightening. It is intimate. It is a companion with moods, with habits, with a patience that outlasts human worry. Long after him, long after dynasties rise and fall, others will keep records of the river's behavior. Flood levels will be noted. Temple inscriptions will tie sacred calendars to the turning seasons and the reigns of kings. Where papyrus survives, administrative writing will show the effort to measure and remember how high the waters came when the land was ready, how time was counted in the language of return. All of it, lamp, river, reed, desert, leans toward a single quiet truth. Egypt begins again and again with water coming back. If you want more stories like this, quiet, cinematic history, you can subscribe and drop a comment. Where are you listening from right now, and what time is it there? I love reading those, especially at night. And so, before we step into the long story of pharaohs and temples and cities, we start here, at night, beside the moving black surface, in a world where the horizon is ancient and the air carries the smell of river plants and distant sand. Because here's the question that follows everything. When a civilization's heartbeat is a river, what happens when the river doesn't return? Wind combs the sand of the western desert, drawing fine lines across the surface the way fingers might smooth a cloth. A dry wadi, empty now, holds the faint memory of water, and in its shallow bed the ground keeps ancient footprints like fading sentences. They are not loud, they do not announce themselves, they simply remain, pressed into earth that has outlasted the people who made them. Far away, the Nile glints. Even at a distance it seems to offer something, a promise, almost, but also a demand, a narrow ribbon of life in a wide land, asking those who live near it to stay close, to learn its moods, to accept its gifts and its limits. In the dark hours, in the heat of day, in the slow turning of seasons, the river pulls attention toward itself, not as an idea, but as a practical truth. Long before dynasties, long before crowns, temples, or the careful lists of kings, people lived in a landscape that would not hold still. Archaeology and environmental study make this much clear. The Sahara was not always the desert we imagine today. There were periods when parts of it were greener, when rain came more often, when grasslands and shallow lakes supported animals and human communities. And then, gradually, the climate shifted. The land dried. Water sources shrank. Paths that once led to pasture began to lead only to dust. As aridity increased, communities were pressed toward the Nile Valley, not in a single dramatic migration, but in a long, patient narrowing of possibility. When the wide spaces could no longer sustain the same kind of life, the river's corridor became more than a place to visit. It became a home to gather around. In that gathering, a new kind of stability began to take shape. Farming and herding took root along the valley and its edges. Fields could be planned. Animals could be kept and bred. Villages formed. Not grand cities yet, but clusters of homes and storage, places where generations could live within the same horizon. Craft. Traditions deepened as well. Pottery styles shifted over time in ways archaeologists can trace, like a slow-changing accent. Stone tools refined. Burial customs evolved, quietly reflecting what people valued and what they feared. None of this happened in an instant. It was life, repeating, learning, adjusting. Somewhere near the river, a potter sits close to water and clay. You can picture the hands first, because hands are often the truest part of any ancient story. They smooth the surface of a vessel with water and ash, coaxing the shape into something balanced and useful. The clay is cool at first, then gradually firms under steady palms. The potter's thumb leaves a brief mark and then erases it, again and again, until the curve feels right. Later, the vessel will be fired. It will harden into something that can outlast its maker. It will hold beer and grain, water and oil. It will sit in a corner where someone reaches for it at dawn without thinking. It will be part of the quiet routine of survival. The kind of routine that rarely finds its way onto temple walls, but forms the true foundation of any civilization. Over generations, those routines gather into patterns. In Upper Egypt, archaeologists describe a sequence of cultural development often called the Nakada sequence. This is not a single town telling the whole story, but a way of naming the growth of complexity seen through sites, cemeteries, and material remains. What becomes clear as the sequence unfolds is that regional networks deepen. People are not only living beside the river, they're connected along it. Goods travel, styles spread, ideas move from one community to another, carried by boats, by caravans, by marriages, by the simple human habit of noticing and copying what seems powerful or beautiful. With those networks comes change in how society is arranged. This is where scholars become careful, because the evidence speaks in hints rather than speeches. In graves and burial goods, signs of hierarchy begin to appear. Some individuals are buried with more objects, more elaborate items, or symbols that suggest higher standing. Some graves seem to draw the attention of the living, marked more carefully. And while the basic fact is visible, that differences existed, what those differences mean is debated. Some historians and archaeologists suggest we are seeing chiefdoms, communities led by powerful families or local rulers whose influence grew through control of resources, trade routes, or ritual authority. Others emphasize the early shaping of state-like structures, forming not smoothly but through competition and alliance, through moments of tension and negotiation. In either interpretation, the sense is the same. Power is beginning to take a recognizable form, not yet as a crown that everyone would understand, but as an uneven gravity, drawing some people toward the center, placing others at the edges. And still, life continues in its ordinary way. People plant, people harvest, people argue over water and land. Children are born into a world where the river matters more than any distant idea of nation. Sometimes death enters quietly. A family burial, prepared with care, lies beneath the earth. There are goods placed beside the body. Perhaps a pot, perhaps a tool, perhaps something meant to be useful beyond the visible world. The fact of careful placement is something archaeology can establish. The meaning behind it is harder. Some scholars suggest the goods reflect status, a way of showing the community where this person stood. Others emphasize affection and grief, love expressed through objects because words cannot do enough. And it's tempting to wonder, briefly, if fear also played a role. Fear of the unknown, fear that without proper gifts the dead might suffer or return or simply vanish into darkness. In that mixture, love, status, fear, belief begins to gather shape. By the late 4th millennium BCE, symbols of authority and shared religious imagery begin to spread across regions. This is a matter of material evidence, recurring motifs, increasingly standardized signs, objects that suggest recognized power. The river again is the conduit, not only for goods but for ideas. A symbol seen in one place appears in another. A pattern, repeated on pottery, feels familiar far downstream. Communities begin to recognize one another as part of something larger, even if they would not yet call it a kingdom. Out in the desert, older traces linger too. Rock art and settlement remains that speak of earlier landscapes and earlier ways of life. The desert is not only a place of emptiness, it is a memory field. It holds images carved into stone when the land was different, when water was nearer. Now, as the climate tightens its grip, those marks become like distant voices. They remind us that people adapt, but they also carry their past with them, even when forced into new boundaries. And this is where our footing becomes firm for a moment, because the long dawn is not told to us by one voice. It is pieced together from what survives. Predynastic cemeteries leave behind patterns of burial and the goods placed with the dead. decorated pottery from Nakada sites carries motifs and styles that move through time like slow signals. Settlement traces show where people cooked, stored, and worked. And in the desert, rock art remains, figures and scenes carved into stone, hinting at earlier worlds of water and movement. These fragments do not give us a single clear narrative. They give us a chorus, broken, incomplete, but real. And so the river becomes home in a deeper way. Not just a place to pass through, but a place where power can grow, because resources can be counted, because fields can be measured, because boats can carry goods and messages, because the rhythm of flood and harvest can be used as a scaffold for authority. When people are drawn into closeness, the questions of who leads and how become sharper. A civilization is beginning, but it does not yet know its own name. It is only people gathering closer to the Nile, learning its language, building routines that will one day support kings and temples. In the soft light before dawn, you can almost feel the moment when a world is not yet fixed, when the future is still open, and power is still being invented in small decisions made beside the water. When the desert grew harsher and the river became home, what new kinds of power were born beside the water? Dawn mist clings to the riverbanks, softening the world into pale shapes. The water is quiet, almost glassy, and the horizon seems to hesitate between night and day. In the half-light, banners stir on the decks of boats, animal forms and sacred emblems moving gently, as if they are breathing. Oars dip into the Nile without a splash, and the boats glide forward with practiced ease, leaving only a thin seam of ripples behind them. It feels like a procession, not hurried, not noisy, but deliberate. In the long dawn of Egypt, the river has already drawn people close enough for villages to become networks, and networks to become something more. Now, in the late 4th millennium BCE, the signs begin to point toward a new shape of authority. One that is no longer only local, no longer only personal, but increasingly political. Early kingship emerges most clearly from Upper Egypt, from the southern stretches of the Nile where communities had been growing more complex for generations. This is the foundation scholars agree on. Power is consolidating. Leaders who may once have ruled small regions begin to extend influence farther along the river. Resources can be gathered, redistributed, demanded. Alliances form, rivalries sharpen. Over time, the idea takes hold that the valley and the delta, the southern land and the northern land, belong together. Later Egyptians will speak of this as the two lands, a phrase that carries both geography and meaning, two worlds joined into one order. And woven into the earliest imagery of that joining is the traditional figure of Narmer. We have to be careful with what this means. It is an established fact that Narmer is associated with early unification imagery and royal authority, and that his name appears in early contexts. But the way later generations told the story can make it seem like a single moment. One king, one decisive act, one crown placed on one head. Some historians suggest the truth was slower and messier, a process rather than an event. Part conquest, part negotiation, part symbolic narrative crafted to make political consolidation feel inevitable, even sacred. Still, symbols matter, especially at the beginning. In this period, writing appears, not in epics or poems, not as a way to preserve personal memories, but in the practical world of administration. Labels, tallies, early hieroglyphic signs tied to goods and institutions. Words begin as marks that cling to objects, jars, bundles, shipments. Writing emerges as a tool for the state before it becomes a tool for the soul. Imagine a young scribe in training, sitting cross-legged in the shade of a wall. He is not yet the kind of figure carved on temple stone. He is only learning. His teacher's voice is calm but strict. A set of marks is laid before him, signs that stand for bread, cattle, place names. Each one is more than a drawing. Each one is a decision about how the world will be counted. The scribe learns to turn spoken life into recorded life, to transform a river full of motion into rows of meaning. There is a quiet power in that. To write is to fix, to name is to claim. And in early dynastic Egypt, the state begins to form not only through armies and agreements, but through the steady expansion of record-keeping, an invisible net cast over grain, labour, livestock, land. It is not romantic, but it is revolutionary. It allows authority to travel farther than a single leader's presence. It allows a ruler to see beyond the horizon through the eyes of officials and scribes. At the same time, rulers establish centres of power and ritual. They create places where administration and sacred practice intertwine, because in Egypt, rule is never only political. Early dynastic kings develop an ideology that links the king to divine order. This is a mainstream point in Egyptology. The ruler is not simply a strong man with followers. He is framed as the hinge between the human world and the larger structure of the cosmos. His authority is not merely enforced, it is explained as necessary. That explanation will become one of Egypt's most enduring inventions. The king is presented as the one who keeps the world balanced, who ensures that the river returns, that the seasons hold, that the gods and humans remain in their proper places. Whether ordinary people experience this as comfort, as control, or as distant abstraction would have varied. The evidence does not preserve their private thoughts, but the shape of the ideology begins here, early, and it will echo through millennia. And so, the story of unification is also the story of meaning being arranged. The two lands is not only a map, it is a claim that opposites can be joined, south and north, valley and delta, desert edge and floodplain. The imagery of unification teaches people how to imagine their own country. It becomes a kind of mental architecture, as important as any wall or canal. One of the iconic ceremonial objects associated with this early moment is what we call the Nama palette. It survives because it was made to survive, stone-shaped and carved in a way meant to endure. Alongside it, early dynastic labels and seal impressions from royal contexts show the machinery of the new order, names of officials, institutions, goods passing into state control. These are not stories in the modern sense, but they are the bones of a story being built, evidence of a world learning to organize itself around a central authority. And yet, even with all this, the mist still clings to the river in the morning. Boats still move quietly, guided by current and shoreline. Farmers still watch the fields. Potters still smooth clay. The new state does not erase the old rhythms. It wraps itself around them. It learns to speak their language, and then, slowly, to command it. Some historians suggest that this is how power lasts, not by replacing everyday life, but by making itself seem like the natural guardian of it. The banners on the boat stir again. The oars rise and fall. The mist begins to lift, and somewhere in, the half-light between village and palace, between local shrine and royal ritual, a new idea takes hold, an idea that will shape everything that follows. If power begins as a story told in symbols, who gets to decide what the story means? Inside a cool storeroom, the air smells faintly of grain and clay. Jars line the walls like silent witnesses, rounded bellies pressed close together, their mouths sealed, their surfaces marked with signs that mean something to the people who put them here. In the dimness, time feels stored as much as food does. The room is still, the jars do not speak, and yet they seem full of attention, as if they have watched seasons pass and hands come and go for years. Outside, sunlight strikes mud brick streets and turns them the colour of baked earth. Children move between doorways, donkeys shift under loads. Somewhere, a drumbeat begins, slow, steady, calling people toward a shrine. It is not the sound of panic. It is the sound of gathering, of ritual, of a community remembering what it is supposed to do. This is early dynastic Egypt in the first and second dynasties, when the new idea of kingship has begun to settle into daily life. Royal and administrative institutions expand. This is an established feature of the period. The state becomes more capable of collecting, storing, and redistributing resources. Taxation is often not coins or cash. Those are far in the future, but taxation in kind. Grain measured and delivered, livestock counted, labour owed. The state's strength is not only in its symbols, but in its ability to gather the work of many into one organised flow. And in that flow, a key political centre rises near the apex of the delta, Memphis. Its location matters. Memphis sits in a place that naturally links Upper and Lower Egypt, the valley and the branching delta. It becomes a hinge point of geography, and therefore a hinge point of power. From such a place, messages can travel both south and north. Goods can be directed. Ritual authority can be displayed in ways that feel central, not provincial. But even as power gathers, it does not erase the local world. It threads through it. Religious landscapes grow more formal in this era. Local gods remain, tied to particular places, particular fields, particular stretches of riverbank. At the same time, royal cults develop, and temple economies begin to take shape alongside administration. Temples are not only sacred spaces, they become institutions, landholders, employers, storerooms of offerings, centres where the divine and the practical meet. This is not yet the monumental temple Egypt will later build in stone, but the direction is clear. Religion and statecraft are growing together, like two branches of the same tree. You can feel it in the rhythm of ordinary work. On a royal estate, a worker measures grain into baskets. The task is routine. His hands know the weight. He tips the grain, levels it, repeats the motion again and again until the count is satisfied. Each basket is small on its own, but together they become the invisible fuel of the state, feeding officials, priests and palaces, sustaining the projects that will later appear as grandeur. In the moment, though, it is simply labour, steady and quiet, done under the sun. Nearby, in a village, a healer mixes herbs. We know as a fact that practical knowledge of plants and treatments existed, even if the specifics are unevenly preserved from this early period. And some historians suggest that healing in such communities rarely drew a clean line between medicine and sacred protection. A mixture might be chosen for its physical effect, but also spoken over, blessed, carried with an amulet, or accompanied by gestures meant to turn away harm. Where does one end and the other begin? It is a question that may not have mattered to the people themselves. Relief is relief. Safety is safety. And the world is full of forces both seen and unseen. As institutions strengthen, ideas about death also become more structured. Tomb architecture and funerary practices grow increasingly elaborate. This is a well-established pattern. Burials reflect not only wealth and status, but beliefs about continuity after death, about the possibility that the dead remain, in some form, connected to the living world. The tomb becomes more than a place to put a body. It becomes a kind of residence, a point of contact, a promise that identity can persist. In this period, mastaba tombs, rectangular mud, brick or stone structures, appear as a prominent form, especially in areas like Saqqara. They sit on the edge of the desert like quiet houses for the dead, their shapes low and grounded, as if the earth itself is trying to hold what might otherwise drift away. And seal impressions, small, practical objects pressed into clay, record officials and institutions, showing again how the state's reach extends into burial, ritual and memory. And this is where we can pause, just long enough to feel the evidence beneath the story. Early dynastic life does not come to us as a single written chronicle. It comes in the solid geometry of mastaba tombs at places like Saqqara, burial architecture that shows changing ideas about death, status and continuity. It comes in seal impressions and administrative markings that preserve names, titles and institutions, small, everyday tools of a growing state. Even a lump of clay stamped and then forgotten can carry the outline of power. Who counted the grain? Who oversaw the storeroom? Who belonged to which household of authority? These are humble traces, but they are the fingerprints of a world learning how to organize itself. And yet, for all this expansion, the balance between local autonomy and central control likely shifted often, even this early. That is an interpretation, but a reasonable one. The Nile is long, communities are diverse, communication is possible but not effortless. Strong center may demand more one year, loosen its grip the next. A local leader might cooperate, resist, negotiate. The state is still learning how to be a state. Its authority is real, but it is also in motion. So life in early dynastic Egypt is lived in overlapping worlds. The village and the center, the local shrine and the royal cult, the storeroom jar and the tomb's sealed chamber. People wake, work, eat, pray, argue, mourn. Above them, the idea of the king grows heavier, more than a ruler, framed as the one who holds divine order in place. And that is a strange thing to live with. To know that somewhere, perhaps far from your mud brick street, a single human being is spoken of as the hinge between earth and sky. To feel the state in the weight of grain baskets and the rhythm of temple drums. To sense that the world is being counted, named, recorded, while your own worries remain small, immediate and personal. The drumbeat continues. People move toward the shrine. The storeroom stays cool and dim, holding its jars of counted grain. And beyond the town, the desert waits, patient and watchful, as it always has. What does it feel like to live in a world where the king is not just ruler, but the hinge between earth and sky? The desert at Giza at night is colder than people imagine. The heat drains away as the sun disappears, leaving the air sharp and clean. Above, the stars look close enough to touch. Below, the pyramids rise like dark mountains, immovable shapes cut against the sky, not quite natural, not quite human. They seem to belong to the earth, and yet also to stand apart from it, as if they have been placed there by intention rather than chance. Downwind, from somewhere lower on the plateau, the faint scent of charcoal drifts from a worker's camp. A few small fires glow, shadows gather around them. You can hear murmurs, the clink of a pot, the soft scrape of someone shifting on a mat. In the immense stillness of the desert, even those small sounds feel precious. This is the Old Kingdom, the long stretch of Egypt's early dynasties, 3rd through 6th, often remembered, especially by later Egyptians, as an age of monumental building and strong central power. That remembrance is rooted in real change. The Old Kingdom develops a powerful centralized administration and a royal ideology that becomes increasingly confident. The state is no longer only expanding, it is maturing. The machinery of officials, taxation, storerooms, estates, and scribes grows capable of organizing enormous projects. The king's place in the world is framed not merely as important, but as essential. Authority becomes a kind of architecture, visible in stone, but also built into the everyday flow of goods and labor. And then, early in this era, something happens that shifts the horizon. The step pyramid of Dioza marks a major architectural and ideological change. Before it, elite burials and royal tombs existed, but here the ambition takes a new form. A layered structure rises above the desert edge, stone arranged in steps as if the king's resting place is also a stairway, a statement, a ladder toward permanence. It is not only a building, it is an idea made solid that the king's presence should endure beyond a lifetime, beyond the memory of those who saw him alive. Some historians suggest that this is where Egypt's confidence in its own continuity begins to harden into certainty. Because stone is different from mud brick. Stone does not soften in rain. It does not crumble as easily. It holds shape, and so it encourages the mind to imagine that what is built in stone can hold meaning just as firmly. From that shift, the path leads toward the great constructions of the 4th dynasty, the Great Pyramids at Giza. It is an established fact that these pyramids were supported by extensive labour organisation and provisioning systems. They did not appear through magic, nor through a handful of hands. They required planning, stone extraction, transport, skilled craftwork, and a constant flow of food and supplies. They required the state to coordinate bodies and materials across time, season after season, turning the Nile's annual rhythm into a kind of engine. At dawn, before the light fully spreads, a baker rises. The camp is still dim, and the air holds that dry cold that clings to skin. The baker's hands work quickly, not because he is rushed, but because the scale of his task has long ago taught him its own rhythm. He shapes hundreds of loaves, he tends fires, he watches the colour of the crust. Bread and beer become the currency that keeps bodies moving stone, fuel measured in daily portions, in rations, in the simple truth that a man cannot haul what he cannot eat. This is not a romantic scene, it is practical, and it is, in its own way, sacred. Because feeding a workforce is feeding the monument. Each loaf is a small piece of the pyramid, just as much as each block of limestone. Nearby, in the early light, stone haulers gather. They tighten ropes. They test the sled runners. They talk softly, perhaps, or not at all. Their shoulders know what is coming. And here we step into interpretation, because the evidence tells us the system existed, but not always how it felt from the inside. Some scholars emphasize that labour could be experienced in different ways, as corvée duty owed to the state, as seasonal work when the Nile's flood made farming temporarily impossible, as skilled employment with pride attached to it, and perhaps as all of these at once, depending on the person and moment. The scale and emphasis are still debated. What seems clear is that the workforce was organised and provisioned, supported by systems that left traces in archaeology. But inside a stone hauler's body, none of the debate matters in the moment. The rope pulls, the muscles strain, the sun climbs, sweat dries quickly in desert air. It's tempting to wonder what he tells himself as he leans into the weight. Pride in service, quiet resentment, or simply endurance without words. The kind of endurance that does not need to be named to exist. Above all of this, the royal ideology thickens. State religion and temple institutions expand during the Old Kingdom. The king is framed as guarantor of Mat, cosmic balance and rightful order. Mat is not just morality in the modern sense. It is the idea that the universe has a proper alignment, a rightness that must be maintained. The king is presented as the one who keeps that rightness in place. His role touches the Nile's return, the fertility of fields, the stability of society, the relationship between humans and gods. Whether everyone believed this with the same intensity is unknowable, but the state's public language insists on it. Ritual and administration intertwine. Temples hold land and resources. Priests and officials move through corridors of power that are both sacred and economic. In this world, building a pyramid is not only building a tomb, it is reinforcing the idea that the king's death is not an ending, but a transformation that must be managed. The pyramid becomes a visible anchor for continuity, a statement that the order of the world will persist. At Giza, that statement is written at a scale almost beyond comprehension, and yet the human world remains close to the ground. Archaeology from the Giza worker village reveals traces of provisioning, housing, craft activity, evidence of a living community supporting the monumental project. Old Kingdom tomb reliefs depict estates, food production, crafts, and the steady flow of goods that made elite life and state projects possible. These images are shaped by ideology, yes, but they also preserve details of work, the way bread is stacked, the way cattle are handled, the way hands shape material into usefulness. In the evenings, after the heat recedes, the camp breathes again. People eat, they talk, someone laughs briefly, then quiets. A man rubs his shoulder and stares out at the darkening pyramid silhouette, trying to understand what he has spent his day building. He may not have words like legacy or ideology for it. He may only know that the structure is growing and that the state's attention feels like sunlight, warm when it provides, harsh when it demands. The desert wind carries charcoal scent across the plateau. The stars turn slowly overhead. The pyramids hold their shapes, absorbing starlight without giving anything back, and beneath their shadow, a question rises, not loudly, but persistently, like the Nile's own return. When you build a mountain for a king, what do you hope survives? His name, your life, or something unseen? A dry wind rattles the reeds along the Nile's edge, making a thin, restless music. The sound is familiar, but tonight it feels sharper, as if the air itself has grown brittle. In a dim household, a clay lamp burns low. Its flame leans and shivers with every small draught that slips through the doorway. Shadows gather in the corners, and the room seems smaller than it did in brighter years. Outside, the river's edge feels farther away than it should. Not because the Nile has vanished, but because certainty has. The steady confidence of the Old Kingdom, the sense of a centre that can summon grain, labour and stone into order, has begun to weaken. The great mountains of kings still stand in the desert, unmoving, but the machinery that once fed them is not as smooth. The state's voice grows less unified. Its reach, once long and firm, begins to loosen. This is the first intermediate period, a span of time after the Old Kingdom when central authority weakens and regional power rises. As a matter of established history, regional governors, often called nomarchs, gain resources and influence. They become more than administrators serving a distant king. In many places, they are the strongest authority people feel directly. They control local land, local labour, local grain. They sponsor building projects and funerary monuments of their own. Their names become prominent in local memory, their loyalties shifting with circumstance, their ambitions growing in a world where the old centre cannot command as it once did. Political fragmentation follows. Competing centres emerge, and Egypt's unity begins to look more like a memory than a fact. Two cities become especially significant in this contest: Heracleopolis in the north and Thebes in the south. Each becomes a magnet for allegiance, each claims legitimacy, each gathers supporters and resources, and in time, conflict becomes part of the landscape, not always visible in every village, but present in the way people talk, in the uncertainty of whose authority will hold next season. Material and textual evidence suggests periods of stress and instability during this era. Though conditions varied by region, that variation matters. Some places likely experienced hardship more sharply. Disrupted trade, insecure land, shifting demands. Other places may have continued with relative steadiness, protected by strong local leadership or fortunate conditions. Egypt is long, and the Nile's gifts are not distributed evenly. Even in stable times, the river can be generous in one region and stingy in another. In a household like the one lit by the low lamp, the difference between stability and stress is felt in the simplest thing: grain. A mother measures it carefully into a small container, then pauses, then levels it again as if patience could make it last longer. She counts with her eyes and hands, not with writing. She knows what a basket should feel like when it is full, and she knows what it means when it is not. She stretches supplies through uncertain seasons, making meals thinner, saving a little more for tomorrow, teaching children to accept less without complaint. The world of royal ideology, Mat, divine order, the king as guarantor, feels far away in such a room. What matters is whether there will be bread next week. And still, outside, life continues. Local cultures and art styles persist. This is an important fact. The first intermediate period is not a blank space where everything collapses into silence. Tombs are built, objects are made, communities still marry, bury, plant, harvest. In some places, local identity may even deepen, because when the center weakens, the local becomes more visible. A region's customs, its preferred styles, its particular gods and rituals can flourish in the space left by central uniformity. Yet the period's memory is often coloured by later storytelling. Some historians suggest that narratives of chaos from this era may be amplified by later royal ideology, using disorder as a foil for reunification. Later kings who restored unity had reasons to describe the past as dark and broken, because it made their own rule appear like a return of light. This does not mean hardship was invented. It means the way hardship was framed may have been shaped by politics, by the need to teach a lesson. Without a strong king, the world falls apart. In the middle of this shifting world, local officials become crucial figures. A man sits in a small administrative space, perhaps not grand but functional, listening to disputes between neighbours, land boundaries, water access, debts, a stolen goat, a marriage agreement gone sour. He mediates because someone must. And here we enter interpretation again. Was he protector or profiteer? Some days he may have been both. In a fractured landscape, an official's power can be used to steady a community or to squeeze it. The same hand that settles a dispute can also collect extra grain for itself. The evidence of shifting loyalties and local authority suggests a world where survival often depends on personal networks, favours, and the ability to navigate changing power. And this is where the age becomes visible in the way it speaks to us. Not through one royal voice, but through many local ones. Regional elite tomb inscriptions survive from this period. Names, titles, boasts, prayers, and claims of standing carved into stone in provincial cemeteries. They show governors presenting themselves as protectors, as providers, as people worthy of remembrance. Alongside them, scattered administrative records, where they survive, hint at the practical reality beneath the words grain collected, labour organised, loyalties counted. These traces do not give us a single, tidy narrative of collapse. They give us a landscape of competing authority, each centre trying to sound steady while the ground shifts underfoot. In other words, Egypt has not stopped telling stories about itself. It is simply telling them in several voices instead of one. Meanwhile, the pyramids remain. They stand in the desert like the bones of an older certainty, reminding everyone that there was once a centre strong enough to build mountains. Now, in villages and towns, people live under different pressures. The Nile still floods and recedes, but the human order around it feels less secure. The river's rhythm continues, indifferent to politics. Yet politics determines who gets grain in a lean year, who has protection, who is forced into service, who can sleep without fear. In the dim household, the lamp burns lower. The mother finishes measuring and ties the grain sack shut. Outside, the reeds keep rattling. The river feels farther away than it should, not in distance, but in the sense that its gifts no longer guarantee safety. And so the chapter closes on a quiet question, soft as wind through dry stalks. When the centre cannot hold, what keeps a community from dissolving into the sand? Morning light spills into a temple court, pale at first, then strengthening as the sun climbs. Stone and plaster catch the glow and soften it, turning brightness into something calm. Incense hangs in the air, sweet, faintly sharp, lingering in slow curls that seem to move with their own patience. Somewhere nearby, a reed pen scratches across papyrus. The sound is small but steady. It carries the feeling of order returning, not through force or spectacle, but through repetition, line after line, record after record. After fracture, after competing centres and uncertain seasons, Egypt begins to gather itself again. The Theban kings reunify the land. This is established history. Power coalesces in the south and moves outward until Egypt is once more imagined as a single body. The reunification is not only a political event, it is also a restoration of confidence. The state rebuilds its administrative strength. Officials are organized. Records multiply. Institutions take clearer shape. In later memory, this period becomes associated with renewal, often called the Middle Kingdom, an era many scholars describe as marked by cultural flourishing as well as stronger administration. The difference is felt not only in courts and palaces, but in the ground itself. Major irrigation and agricultural projects expand, including development in the Fayum region, broadly associated with Middle Kingdom planning. There is evidence of increased attention to land management, water control, and agricultural expansion. The aim is practical: more grain, more stability, more predictable provisioning. But it is also political. A state that can reshape wetlands, direct canals, and support new cultivation is a state announcing its competence. It is saying quietly but firmly, we can feed you, and therefore we can rule. The river's rhythm remains the heartbeat, but now the state tries to guide the flow of that heartbeat into wider veins, and beyond the fields the horizon expands. Trade and expeditions intensify. Egypt looks south to Nubia for gold and resources, and north and east toward the Levant and Red Sea routes for goods. This is an established pattern. The Middle Kingdom is associated with increased movement, boats loaded, caravans formed, officials dispatched. Not every person experiences this directly, but it changes the atmosphere of the country. Strange materials appear, new ideas travel with merchants and envoys. The state's attention extends outward, because security and wealth now depend on corridors beyond the valley. Along those corridors, fortresses rise in Nubia. They reflect strategic control over borders and trade routes. Stone and mud brick outposts set in places where the river narrows and the landscape becomes watchful. Their presence is a statement of intent, to oversee movement, to secure resources, to define where Egypt ends and where the unknown begins. Archaeology in regions associated with these fortifications, places often discussed in relation to sites like Buin, anchors this reality. Walls and gates, foundations and barracks remnants, the physical skeleton of a policy written into the land. At night, in one of these border garrisons, a soldier watches the river. He stands where the darkness is thick, listening for unfamiliar oars. Water is a road here, as it always is, but roads bring both goods and danger. His duty is shaped by distance from home. The air smells different. The river feels less familiar. He might think of his village far north, where the reeds sounded softer, where faces were known. Here, every sound carries weight, a shift in current, a faint splash, the hush of voices from across the water. He rests his hand on his weapon more from habit than panic, and he waits, patient, because waiting is the job. Meanwhile, far from the border, another kind of waiting happens in quiet rooms. A scribe sits with papyrus laid out before him, copying a story in carefully ruled lines. We know Middle Kingdom papyri and literary texts survive as sources, enough to show a rich tradition of writing beyond mere accounts, even if much is lost. The scribe's work is not loud, it is intimate. His reed pen moves steadily, preserving something that matters: wisdom, doubt, reflection. The sense that human life is not only labour and taxes, but also thought. In a world that has recently known fracture, the act of copying a story is itself a form of stitching, threading meaning back into continuity. And here, again, we can feel the story's foundation under our feet. The Middle Kingdom reaches us through two kinds of surviving trace. One is written papyri that preserve administration and literature, records of what was collected, what was planned, and also what was imagined, feared, or hoped for. The other is built, the remains of fortresses in Nubia, where walls and gates still outline a strategy of control along the river corridor. Together, these sources show a state doing two things at once: thinking on paper and holding space in stone and mud brick. They let us see renewal not as a slogan, but as a structure, words that organize and fortifications that watch. And above these daily labours, the state shapes its own image. Middle Kingdom royal ideology often presents an ideal of just kingship. This is where interpretation enters carefully. Some historians suggest that the image of the righteous protective king is partly aspiration and partly political messaging. After a period when central authority failed, it is useful to declare, again and again, that the king is a source of fairness, stability, and balance. The claim may reflect genuine administrative reforms and cultural values, and it may also serve to remind elites and commoners alike that unity has a moral dimension. Order returns, but it returns with memory. The Middle Kingdom is not simply the Old Kingdom rebuilt. It carries lessons, scars, adjustments. Perhaps there is greater awareness of regional power. Perhaps there is more emphasis on administration as a stabilizing tool. Perhaps, too, there is a deeper sense of fragility beneath the language of strength, because once a people have seen the centre weaken, they cannot completely forget. Even in a bright temple court, incense drifting, the past lingers like a faint shadow at the edge of vision. The reed pen continues its soft scratching. The soldier continues listening at the border. Fields widen in the Fayum. Boats travel farther. Fortresses stand watch. Egypt, once a mosaic of competing centres, feels like a river rejoined, flowing again in one direction, gathering itself into a single current. And yet, as with any river, the water that returns is never the same water that left. If order can be rebuilt, does it return the same, or does it come back changed like water after a long journey? Delta fog. It lies low over the waterways, turning the world into softened edges and shifting silhouettes. A harbour smells of pitch and salt, of wet rope and river mud. Boats sit close together, their hulls dark against the pale water. Voices drift through the mist. Egyptian speech, yes, but also other tongues, unfamiliar rhythms mixing with familiar ones. And along the quay, a watchman lifts a torch. Its flame throws a trembling light across the surface, making the water flicker like hammered bronze. In this dim, mingled place, Egypt begins to fragment again. After the renewed strength of the Middle Kingdom, after the fortresses, the expanding trade, the sense of a river rejoined, political cohesion loosens. This is an established fact of the period. The second intermediate period brings a return of division, with multiple centres of power. The reasons behind such shifts are complex and debated, but the shape of the outcome is clear. The state that once felt unified becomes layered, contested, less certain of its own borders. In the north, a ruling group with Near Eastern connections, known to us as the Hyksos, establish power in parts of the delta. It is important to say this plainly, without turning it into a single simple story. The Hyksos are not a mythic invasion in the way later narratives sometimes imply. They are a historical reality marked by archaeological and textual traces, a political presence in the delta, associated with a centre at Avaris, and with material culture showing broader regional connections. Their rule changes the map of authority. It introduces new dynamics of allegiance. It reshapes what it means, in practical terms, to belong to the two lands, and yet the south remains. Thebes continues as a significant Egyptian power, holding its place along the upper stretches of the Nile. In a divided country, Thebes becomes more than a city. It becomes a symbol of continuity, a place where older forms of kingship and ritual still carry weight. Thebes watches the north with the patience of a river bank watching a distant storm. It is not silent, but it is waiting, gathering strength, forming alliances, preparing for a future that is not yet settled. Between north and south, daily life continues in familiar ways. Fields are still planted, water is still lifted and guided, bread still rises and bakes, the river still brings its cycles. Political maps may shift, but the work of feeding a household does not pause simply because a ruler has changed his title. In the Delta marketplace, a trader bargains over copper and oil. He stands beneath a canopy of woven reeds, the air thick with dampness and smoke. He listens carefully, because words matter here. A misheard phrase can mean loss. A misunderstood custom can mean insult. He learns, as many people in Borderlands learn, that survival often depends on adaptation more than loyalty. He does not necessarily think in terms of national identity, he thinks in terms of weighing metal, judging quality, noticing who is trustworthy today. Coins do not yet govern this world. Value is still measured in goods and promises. In such a place, language becomes another form of currency. Around him, foreign tongues mingle with Egyptian speech, and the mingling is not only conflict. Some historians suggest that cultural exchange in this era was complex. Foreign rule could mean intermarriage, trade, blended practices, new styles of objects, new ways of doing things, alongside tension and power struggles. People adapt because they must, and because human life is often less rigid than political slogans. A child in the market hears stories of outsiders. The adults speak in lowered voices when they think the child is not listening. They tell tales of difference, of threat, of the way things were before. The child absorbs the mood more than the details, but the marketplace smells the same as it always has. Fish, bread, smoke. The child watches hands exchanging goods, hears laughter in between arguments, feels the press of bodies moving around stalls. To a child, outsider can be a frightening word and yet an abstract one. The world is still made of immediate sensations, hunger, warmth, fear, curiosity. Over time, new military technologies and practices spread across the region. This is an established association of the broader era. The use of chariots becomes linked in scholarly discussion to the military developments of this period and its surroundings. Egypt is not isolated. It is part of a world where methods of warfare evolve through contact, rivalry, and exchange. Tools change, strategies change. And when the time comes for conflict to sharpen, those changes matter. In the south, Theban rulers begin to push north. This is a mainstream historical point. Eventually, Thebes moves from endurance into action, pressing toward reunification. The struggle is not simply about expelling a foreign power. It is about restoring a single center, reclaiming control over the delta's wealth and gateways, and reasserting the idea of Egypt as one land under one authority. The movement north is both military and symbolic. It is a return to the language of unity, made urgent by years of divided rule. The Hyksos period leaves traces that are unusually tangible in archaeology, especially through the site of Avaris, known as Tel el-Daba. Material culture from such contexts shows cross-regional contacts, objects, styles, and arrangements that speak of a delta connected to wider worlds. This is not mere decoration. It is evidence of lived exchange. It reminds us that Egypt has never been a sealed container. The Nile connects inward, yes, but the delta opens outward, and through that openness, people and ideas have always moved. And then, at last, the north changes again. The Theban rulers end Hyksos rule and inaugurate what later historians call the New Kingdom. A new chapter in Egypt's story begins, one that will carry the memory of this period like a scar and a lesson. The state that emerges will be shaped not only by ancient ideals, but by the experience of division, foreign rule, and the necessity of reasserting control. In the foggy harbour, the watchman's torch still flickers. The water still looks like hammered bronze. Boats still creak gently against their moorings. The trader still bargains. The child still breathes in the smell of bread and smoke. And beneath all of it is the quiet question that follows them into the next age. When borders blur and rulers change, what does Egypt mean to someone simply trying to live? Karnak at dusk. The day's heat loosens its grip, and the air begins to cool in slow, grateful breaths. Towering columns become silhouettes, dark trunks rising into a sky that is turning from gold to violet. The carved surfaces, so alive in daylight, now hold their details quietly, as if the stone has chosen to rest. Priests move through the courts like shadows, their sandals whispering over worn thresholds. Somewhere deeper inside, hymns rise and fall, steady and measured, like breath passing through a sleeping body. The New Kingdom begins with reunification. After the blurred borders and shifting rulers of the Second Intermediate Period, the sense of Egypt as a single land is asserted again, not only by proclamation but by action. Military campaigns expand Egyptian influence into Nubia and the Levant. This is established history. The state turns outward with new intensity, securing southern resources and northern routes, pushing beyond the valley with a confidence that feels sharpened by memory. The experience of division has left its mark. Egypt will not easily allow its gateways to slip from its grasp again. And so, the river that once drew people inward now becomes a path outward too. Boats carry troops and officials. Caravans move with supplies. Messages travel between temples and garrisons. The state's reach extends across distance, and distance becomes part of Egypt's daily imagination. The land is still narrow and green, but its political horizon is wide. In this early New Kingdom world, certain rulers become strongly associated with ambitious building programs and expansive statecraft, among them Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. Here we stay close to the established consensus. Their reigns are remembered through inscriptions, monuments, and the marks of organized governance. The state builds and rebuilds, not only to honor gods and kings, but to make power visible. Stone again becomes language. Walls become messages, courtyards and pylons become statements meant to outlast the living. At Deir el-Bahari, temple reliefs show the careful crafting of royal presence in sacred space. At Karnak, expansion continues, an unfolding architecture that seems to grow the way a living organism grows, adding new limbs and chambers over generations. These are not merely decorations, they are public memory shaped into place. And the wealth to fuel this is real. Wealth from trade, tribute and resource control pours into the temples and administrative systems. Gold from Nubia, goods from the Levant and beyond. The state becomes an engine that gathers and redistributes, feeding not only armies but priests, artisans, scribes, and the vast institutional life of temples. In such a world, the line between sacred and economic becomes thin. A temple is a place of ritual, yes, but also a storehouse, a landholder, a center of employment and influence. Some historians suggest that this is where the relationship between kingship, priesthood, and wealth becomes increasingly dynamic. Cooperation and tension intertwine. Kings need temples to legitimize rule, to anchor the divine order in stone. Temples benefit from royal patronage, from land grants and offerings. Yet as wealth accumulates in religious institutions, power gathers there too. The balance shifts and adjusts, sometimes quietly, sometimes with sharper edges. In a state that has learned how fragile unity can be, every major institution becomes both a support and a potential rival. And beneath the high politics and monumental building, there is another kind of work done in darkness. In the Valley of the Kings, the royal tomb tradition evolves. This is an established feature of the New Kingdom. Rather than pyramids rising on the desert edge, royal burials increasingly take place in hidden valleys, cut into rock. The reasons include changing religious emphasis and the practical desire for security, though even security is never perfect. The landscape itself becomes part of the burial plan, cliffs and ravines, narrow paths, concealed entrances. The dead king is placed not in a mountain built by human hands, but inside a mountain already formed by the earth. An artisan paints a tomb wall by lamplight. The lamp's flame trembles, the air is close, thick with dust and pigment. The artisan mixes blue carefully, not wasting it, because colour can be precious. He outlines figures with steady attention. His world is a narrow corridor of rock, lit by a small pool of light. He works for a place the living will never inhabit, not in the way they inhabit a house, not with laughter and meals and argument. He works for a journey he cannot see, for a king's afterlife mapped in images and words. This is a fact preserved through what survives: tomb paintings, funerary equipment, traces of craft and planning. We do not need invented details to feel the weight of it. The work itself is enough. The slow, careful labour in a confined space. The knowledge that mistakes matter, because the images are not simply decoration. They are part of a sacred technology, meant to guide and protect. Elsewhere, in Karnak's shadow, a temple singer memorizes hymns. Her voice is steady, trained. She repeats lines until they settle into her body the way breath does. When she sings inside stone, time feels circular. The hymns rise and fall like the Nile's own pulse, reinforcing the sense that the world is held in patterns, day and night, flood and harvest, death and renewal. The singer's life is not written in royal lists, yet she is part of the engine that keeps the sacred world running. Her voice threads through corridors and columns, making the gods present in sound. In the dusk courts of Karnak, priests continue their movements. Offerings are prepared, incense curls. The monument itself seems to drink in the hymns and hold them. Meanwhile, beyond Egypt's borders, campaigns and diplomacy shape a growing sphere of influence. The New Kingdom's expansion is not only violence, It is administration stretched over distance. It is tribute systems. It is negotiation and threat, alliances and resource extraction. Yet even when done through paperwork and ceremony, empire carries a heaviness. It demands constant attention. It requires the center to know what is happening far away. And the farther influence reaches, the more fragile it can become. Still, in this early phase, power begins to feel like destiny. A nation that has survived fragmentation now moves with the confidence of reunification. A royal house that has reasserted control begins to imagine itself as chosen, protected, inevitable. Temples rise, tombs sink deeper into rock, art becomes richer, more intricate. The state's story grows bolder in relief and hymn. But destiny, once believed, becomes its own kind of demand. In Karnak at dusk, the last light clings to the tops of columns. The courts deepen into shadow. The hymns continue, soft, unbroken, while the air cools and the stone holds the warmth of day. And a quiet question begins to form, not as a challenge, but as a thought carried forward on the evening breeze. What happens to a soul and to a state when power begins to feel like destiny? A new city rises on a bare horizon. Amarna, Akhenaten stretches across a wide bend of the Nile where the desert presses close and the cliffs stand like pale guards. There is little softness here. The sunlight feels sharper, as if the air itself has been thinned. The desert wind moves through streets and courtyards with a dry insistence, and it can seem, in imagination, as though it is scraping old names from the air, erasing familiar prayers the way sand erases footprints. This is not the Egypt of Karnak's deep shade and accumulated stone. It is something newly declared, newly commanded. In this period, Akhenaten promotes the Aten and shifts royal religious emphasis dramatically, founding a new capital at Akhenaten, what we call Amarna. This is established history. A pharaoh redirects the focus of state religion toward a solar deity, the Aten, and in doing so he reshapes the visible sacred world of Egypt. The move is not subtle. It is not a gradual adjustment over generations. It is a deliberate recentering, made tangible through the creation of a new city built to embody the change. A capital is not just an administrative choice. It is a statement about where reality should gather, and in Amarna even art begins to change. The artistic style shifts noticeably. We see more intimate royal scenes, distinct proportions, and new iconography. This is not a minor variation. It signals a new visual language, one that emphasizes different aspects of kingship and divinity. The sun's rays become a presence. The royal family appears in ways that feel closer, more immediate, more human, yet still framed by power. It is as if the state's imagery has turned its face toward a single light and is learning to speak anew in its glare. For those who make their living in stone, the change is felt in the hands. A stone carver sits before a block, tools laid out with familiar weight. But what is permitted to appear on the stone is no longer what it was yesterday. He relearns the boundaries of depiction. What sacred forms are now desired? What symbols are now forbidden or discouraged? Yesterday's gods, once carved with confidence, are quietly replaced by today's commands. His craft remains the same in its physical demands. The careful strike, the controlled pressure, the patience required to keep a line true. Yet the meaning of the line has changed, and that change makes the work feel uncertain in a new way. Not because stone is difficult, it always has been, but because the world behind the stone is shifting. Why did Akhenaten do this? Here the outline asks for interpretation, and the historical record invites it. Motives remain debated. Some scholars suggest sincere theology, a genuine conviction that the Aten should be elevated. that the divine should be understood in a new, more focused way. Others emphasize political strategy, arguing that shifting religious emphasis could also weaken entrenched priesthoods and redistribute influence. And many historians lean toward a mix: personality and circumstance, belief and power, ideal and calculation intertwined in ways that are hard to separate cleanly. In human life, motives are rarely single, and in statecraft, they are rarely simple. What makes this period especially vivid to modern historians is that it leaves unusually rich traces, textual and archaeological, including diplomatic correspondence. The Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic tablets, anchor the sense that Egypt's international relationships continue even as the internal sacred world is being rearranged. The world does not pause because a king shifts religious emphasis. Foreign rulers still send messages, requests still arrive, complaints, negotiations, expectations. These continue, written into clay and carried across distance. In other words, the machinery of empire still turns, even as the sky is being renamed. Archaeology of Amarna's city layout and houses adds another layer: streets, foundations, domestic spaces that let us glimpse the shape of daily life in a capital built quickly, with intention. It is a city planned as an idea. Yet within it, people still cook, sleep, argue, carry water, raise children. Even in a place meant to embody a new theology, ordinary life keeps its familiar weight. And that is where the quietest tension may have lived. Consider a household shrine. Not the grand altars of official temples, but a small space in a home where a family turns toward the unseen. Here we step carefully into interpretation. Some historians suggest that religious change at the top does not always translate neatly into the private lives of ordinary people. Do families change their prayers overnight, simply because a king has declared a new emphasis? Or do old gods linger in whispered corners, in remembered names, in gestures repeated from childhood, in protective habits that feel too risky to abandon? It is tempting to wonder, briefly, if the new light of Aten worship shone differently in different hearts. For some, perhaps, it was thrilling, clarity, simplicity, a directness in the sun's presence. For others, perhaps, it was disorienting, like waking to find the constellations rearranged. And for many, perhaps, it was both at once: compliance in public, continuity in private, a life navigated between command and comfort. But the moment does not last. After Akhenaten, successors, including Tutankhamun, restore older religious institutions and move away from Amarna. This is established history as well. The experiment of the new capital ends, and the state's sacred landscape returns toward familiar forms. Temples regain prominence. Older gods return to official favor. Amarna's buildings, so quickly raised, are left behind. The desert wind moves through abandoned spaces, and the sharp sunlight falls on walls that will not be maintained. A city can be declared into existence. It can also be allowed to fade, and yet the disruption leaves an imprint that cannot be completely erased. Because once a king has tried to remake the heavens, the memory of that attempt remains, inside institutions, inside art, inside the private hesitations of people who live through it. The state returns to older patterns, but perhaps with a deeper awareness of how fragile the sacred order can be when it's tied to a single will. In the bare brightness of Amarna, the cliffs watch without expression. The river flows past as it always has, indifferent to names. The wind carries sand through streets where footsteps once sounded with purpose. Somewhere, a stone carver's discarded chips lie half buried, and a household shrine's corner, once used, now silent, holds the shape of a choice that was never entirely free. If a king can remake the heavens in his image, what remains of the old sky inside ordinary hearts? Abu Simbel in Moonlight. The colossal faces sit in a half-world of shadow, as if the night has risen to their shoulders and stopped. Their eyes, carved to face a sun that is not here, hold the dark without blinking. The rock around them cools. The desert breathes out its stored heat slowly, patiently. And somewhere far beyond the reach of these silent giants, a riverboat moves along the Nile, its song thinning into the distance until it becomes only a memory of sound. After the sharp brightness of Amarna, Egypt returns to older patterns, older gods, older temples, older rhythms of power. Yet the memory of that disruption lingers in the background, like a faint mark on stone. The state seems to answer it in part by speaking more loudly in the language it knows best, building, naming, carving, making permanence visible. This is the Ramesside age, the time of the 19th and 20th dynasties. In established history, the era projects power through vast building programs and strong royal imagery. It is not simply that kings build. Many kings have built. It is the particular insistence of it here. The scale, the repetition, the way stone is made to carry a message that can be read without words. The king is present. The king is enduring. The king is meant to be remembered. On temple walls, on pylons, on statues that hold their poses through centuries, kingship becomes a kind of landscape. A traveller can walk into a place and feel that power has been anchored there, planted into the earth like a marker meant to outlast seasons, floods, and the fragile span of human lives. Some of this is practical. Temples are economic centres as well as sacred ones, drawing in land, labour, offerings, administration. But some of it is something quieter and more psychological, an urge to fix a name into the world so firmly that time itself has to walk around it. And in this period, one name, more than any other, settles into that stone. Ramesses, not a single man's shadow exactly, because several kings carry the name. But Ramesses II in particular becomes associated with the sheer weight of monument and memory. His face appears again and again, idealized, calm, certain. His titles run in long lines across walls. His image lifts offerings to the gods, receives life from them, stands at the center of a cosmos arranged to show that order is still intact. Yet the world beyond Egypt's temples is not still. Egypt can test influence in the Levant, and the Battle of Kadesh under Ramesses II becomes a landmark event in this long geopolitical struggle. This is a fact anchored in inscriptions and later historical framing. Rival powers press against one another, seeking advantage in the lands between empires. In such a world, a battle is more than a clash of bodies. It is a contest of reputations, alliances, and the fragile idea of who controls the roads that carry trade, tribute, and news. We should be careful here, because the story of Kadesh comes to us heavily shaped by monumental narrative. Monumental inscriptions and reliefs shape public memory. Kingship carved into stone at a scale meant to outlast generations. In other words, the battle is not only fought on the field, it is fought again on walls, in carved scenes where the king appears with the certainty of a god, the chaos of enemies arranged so that order can be seen defeating disorder. This is not invented. It is the nature of royal display. The stone does not aim for nuance. It aims for permanence. And so the battle becomes part of a larger message. Egypt is strong. Egypt is protected. The king is capable. The gods favour the house of Ramesses, even if the realities on the ground are complicated, and historians have long debated the practical outcomes and the balance of power. What matters for this chapter's feeling is clear. The state wants the world to see stability. It wants people walking into temples to feel in their bones that matter still held in the king's hands. But stone has a curious limitation. It cannot carry the softness of daily uncertainty. For that, we sometimes turn to smaller records, scraps of pottery, brief notes, lists, complaints. And one of the most quietly revealing places in Egypt's history is Deir el-Medina, the village of workers who laboured on the royal tombs. Deir el-Medina ostraca and papyri preserve workmen's records, ordinary administrative traces that show life close to the machinery of royal death and royal afterlife. Here, the grandeur of empire looks different. Here, a man counts rations, not gold, not victory, not the sweep of foreign lands, bread, beer, oil. He measures what arrives, he notes what is missing. He knows the state's strength not by the height of statues, but by whether jars come on time. When provisioning is steady, the world feels held together. When it falters, a crack appears that no pylon can hide. This is established history as well. Later New Kingdom Egypt faces increasing strains, economic pressure, labour unrest and external challenges. These strains are not a single moment, not one dramatic collapse in a day. They are accumulations, a delay, a shortage, a dispute. The sense that the great machine, which once seemed so sure of itself, sometimes stutters. And when it stutters, people feel it first in the simplest places, in hunger, in worry, in the quiet, exhausting labour of continuing. For the necropolis worker, the day begins with routine. He wakes in a small house, perhaps before the sun has fully climbed. He eats what he can. He walks to the cliffs where tombs are cut into stone. There is dust everywhere. Dust in hair, dust in food, dust in the folds of clothing. He works in narrow spaces lit by lamps. He chips rock. He carries debris. He shapes corridors that will one day hold the body of a king. And in the evenings, he returns to a village where life is ordinary again. Children run. Someone mends a tool. Someone argues over a boundary or a borrowed jar. And always, in the background, there is the question of supplies, whether the next delivery will come as promised, whether the state that speaks so loudly in stone is still listening to the quieter needs that keep its workers alive. Somewhere else, far from these cliffs, a soldier stands watch. Egypt's reach has been extended and defended across distances, and men are sent where they did not choose to go. A soldier may sleep under a sky that feels unfamiliar, the stars arranged differently above him, or the winds carrying scents he does not know. His duties are shaped by orders and by fear. Fear of ambush, fear of failing, fear of never seeing home again. At night, he touches an amulet. The object is small, worn smooth at the edges, warmed by his thumb. He holds it the way you hold a promise when you can't hold the person who made it. For a moment, the world narrows to that familiar shape. Protection, memory, home. In that moment, empire becomes personal. A monument does not comfort you in the dark. A mother's blessing might. And this, perhaps, is the hidden tension of the Ramesside age. The public face is stone, colossal, declarative, designed to outlast. But the lived experience underneath it is made of bodies, tired bodies, hungry bodies, bodies that want to be safe. The state projects power, yet its ability to sustain that projection depends on the steady fulfillment of small promises, rations delivered, wages paid, borders held, trade flowing. As the later New Kingdom moves forward, external pressures mount. Here we step carefully into interpretation. The Sea Peoples and broader Late Bronze Age disruptions are debated in causes and dynamics, migration, conflict, climate stress, systemic collapse, or combinations. Some scholars emphasize large movements of people and conflict. Others point to stresses in interconnected systems, trade routes, harvests, political alliances, where strain in one place can ripple outward. And many suggest that multiple factors layered together can produce a world that feels suddenly less stable than it once did. However it happened, the sense is of a broader region under pressure, and Egypt, for all its stone certainty, is not immune. Even monumental reliefs at places like Abu Simbel, Karnak, Medinet Habu carry this story in their own way. Temple reliefs at these sites preserve royal narratives of power and conflict. They show the king as defender, conqueror, restorer. They show enemies subdued, order affirmed. They show a world where threats can be named and overcome, but behind the images the Nile still floods. The harvest still depends on the rhythms of water. The people still depend on bread and beer more than on carved victories. And if the deliveries stop, if the pressures grow, if the borders become harder to hold, then all the stone in the world cannot entirely silence the tremor of uncertainty. Abu Simbel remains in the moonlight. The colossal faces do not change. They do not age as humans do. They wait, holding their expressions as if they are beyond worry. Yet somewhere in the darkness near the river, a man counts rations on a shard of pottery. Somewhere, a soldier touches an amulet and listens for sounds in the night. And the empire, speaking in stone, moves forward into a world that is beginning to shift beneath it. When an empire speaks in stone, can it hear the softer warnings written on scraps of pottery? A temple corridor stretches forward in cool shadow. The paint on the walls has dimmed, but it has not vanished. Reds have softened into rust. Blues have deepened into something like dusk. Figures still stand in their ancient poses, gods receiving offerings, kings presenting symbols of order. Though time has laid a thin veil over everything, like dust that no one quite manages to sweep away. Footsteps echo along the stone. Somewhere beyond the columns, the world feels fragmented. The old certainty has loosened. The great voice of empire, so loud in the Ramesside age, so determined to carve itself into permanence, has grown quieter. Yet in this corridor, the air still carries a sense of the sacred. The temple remains a place where the divine is expected to listen, even if the human world outside has become harder to hold together. This is the third intermediate period. In established history, central authority weakens again. Power is shared among dynasties and regional rulers, with strong roles for priesthood and local elites. Egypt does not disappear. The Nile still floods and recedes. Fields are still planted. Children are still born and named. But the old image of a single center controlling the two lands becomes less consistent, less dependable. Rule becomes a patchwork. Authority becomes something negotiated, claimed, contested, balanced. The kingdom begins to resemble a mosaic, and in a mosaic, each piece matters, each region, each family, each temple economy, each alliance. It is in this context that Libyan origin dynasties rule in parts of Egypt. Political geography becomes complex and overlapping. Some rulers hold power in one place while another dynasty claims legitimacy elsewhere. Local elites strengthen their positions, and the priesthood, especially in major temple centers, holds influence not only in ritual, but in land, labor, and administration. To speak of this period as simple decline is tempting only if one expects history to be a straight line. Here we step carefully into interpretation. Rather than a clean collapse, this era can be read as reconfiguration, networks of power shifting from one center to several. Egypt's strength does not vanish. It relocates, disperses, adapts. The old centralized machine is less visible, but local systems become more pronounced. Temples do more than pray. They organize, they store, they redistribute, they remember. And memory in Egypt has always been a form of power. In the human lens of this chapter, we come close to the temple again. A temple administrator sits with accounts. He balances grain, land, offerings, because the gods still need bread even when kings compete. This is an established reality of temple life. Offerings must be tracked, fields managed, workers assigned, festivals supplied. The divine may be eternal, but the logistics of devotion are stubbornly earthly. If the jars do not arrive, if the grain is not measured, if the cattle are not counted, the rituals cannot unfold as they should. And so the administrator's world is one of lists and calculations. He is not a king. He is not carved into monumental relief as a conqueror. Yet he holds a quiet kind of stability. Even when thrones multiply, the temple's daily rhythm offers continuity. The gods are still addressed by name. The hymns still rise. The incense still curls upward in the same familiar way. Outside the temple walls, politics shifts like sand. But inside, order is performed. It is in this period, too, that we begin to see a particular kind of building and rebuilding. Not always in the grand, confident style of earlier ages, but in something more layered. Archaeological layers show reuse and rebuilding across sites like Karnak. Stones are moved, reset, recarved, incorporated into new structures. The past becomes part of the present in a literal way. Here we step into interpretation again, with gentleness. A craftsman works with older stone blocks. He takes a piece that once belonged to a previous monument, perhaps a section of wall, perhaps a fallen fragment, and fits it into a new project. Is this recycling as necessity, because resources are limited and the old stones are there to be used? Or is it reverence, a sense that the work of ancestors carries a kind of blessing, that their stone holds a power worth keeping close? The truth may be both at once. Practical hands do practical work, but in Egypt the past is never merely past. It is a living presence, a storehouse of legitimacy. And in an age where legitimacy is contested, the past becomes even more valuable. Later in this era, the story shifts southward in a way that feels both surprising and deeply connected to older patterns. Nubian, Kushite, kings unify Egypt as the 25th dynasty, emphasizing religious legitimacy and monumental restoration. This is established history. Rulers from Nubia move into Egypt, and they do not present themselves as destroyers of Egyptian tradition, but as its restorers. They align themselves with major religious centers. They build, repair, inscribe. They emphasize the sacred order, reaching for the language of ancient kingship to anchor their rule. In a fragmented world, restoration can be a form of persuasion. It says, the sacred order has not been lost. It can be gathered again. But the wider world is changing, and powerful forces beyond Egypt's borders press in. Assyrian campaigns impact Egypt's political landscape, contributing to further transitions. Armies from the northeast enter the story, not as distant rumours, but as real intrusions into the political balance. The idea of Egypt as a self-contained world becomes harder to maintain. The Nile Valley remains a corridor of life, but it is also part of a larger network of empires and ambitions. And so the third intermediate period carries a double feeling. On one hand, it is a time of division, many thrones, many claims, many centres of authority. On the other hand, it is a time of persistence, temples still functioning, rituals still performed, craftsmen still working, administrators still counting grain so the gods may be fed. In the dim temple corridor, the paint still holds. Not bright as it once was, perhaps, but present. Footsteps continue to echo, as if the building itself remembers every procession that ever passed through. The gods still stand on the walls, receiving offerings in scenes that are meant to be eternal, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the columns, rulers negotiate power like merchants weighing goods, balancing alliances, ancestry and force. If a kingdom becomes a mosaic, can faith and memory serve as the mortar? Alexandria at night. Harbour lights waver on the water, trembling as if the sea itself is breathing. The smell of pitch and salt hangs in the air. Somewhere, an oar knocks softly against wood. Somewhere else, footsteps move along stone quays, and voices rise and fall in languages that mingle in the dark like incense. Greek and Egyptian, perhaps others too, threaded together by trade, argument, and the simple need to be understood. In this city, words feel plentiful. Scrolls are carried through lamplight. Names of philosophers and poets pass from mouth to mouth. New questions are asked in new ways. And yet inland, beyond the harbour's restless glow, older temples still face the stars with patient stone eyes. Their pylons stand as they always have, their courtyards still open to the sky. They do not argue, they do not hurry. They simply endure, as if waiting for the world to remember that it once spoke to the divine in this particular place. After the mosaic of the Third Intermediate period, Egypt's story does not resolve into a single simple ending. It becomes, instead, a long goodbye. In established history, the late period includes periods of Egyptian resurgence and foreign rule, including Persian domination and later Macedonian conquest under Alexander the Great. The names of rulers change, the centers of power shift. Sometimes Egyptians reclaim control in recognizable forms. Sometimes the weight of larger empires presses down, and Egypt becomes part of something wider, administered from elsewhere, shaped by foreign courts and foreign ambitions. Yet even this is not a clean break, because Egypt's strength has never been only in who sits on the throne. It has also been in its institutions, its temples, its land, its habits of memory. The Persian periods bring the reality of being ruled from outside, of being folded into an imperial system that reaches far beyond the Nile Valley. But Egypt remains Egypt in the lived sense. The river still governs planting and harvest, and the old sacred geography still holds meaning. A traveller can still recognise the smell of mud after floodwater, the sound of birds lifting from reed beds, the familiar pattern of villages clustered close to the green strip of life. Then comes the Macedonian conquest associated with Alexander the Great, another established turning point. A new wave of power arrives, not only with armies, but with a cultural world that will settle in Egypt and change it from within. When Alexander's story passes, the Ptolemaic dynasty governs from Alexandria, while also supporting temple building in Egyptian styles, creating layered cultural worlds. This is one of the defining tensions of the era. Alexandria, built as a cosmopolitan capital, carries a different atmosphere from older cities of the Nile. It looks outward. It listens to the sea. It becomes a place where Greek language and forms of learning flourish, where administration is shaped by new traditions, where the court's identity is tied to a Mediterranean world. And yet the Ptolemies also build in Egypt. They support temples in traditional styles. They commission reliefs that follow ancient patterns. They present themselves, in many contexts, as pharaohs in the Egyptian sense, performing rituals, making offerings, aligning their legitimacy with the old sacred order. Temple complexes from the Ptolemaic era, such as Edfu and Dendera, stand as evidence of this continuity in stone. So the world becomes layered. One can imagine it as two winds meeting. The sea wind of Alexandria, carrying debate and commerce, and the desert wind of older temple towns, carrying incense and the long, slow rhythms of ritual. Neither cancels the other completely. Here we step into interpretation with care. Cultural identity becomes increasingly complex, Egyptian, Greek and Roman elements blending differently across class and region. An elite family in Alexandria might live in a world that feels more Greek in language and education, while villagers along the Nile might continue older customs with only gradual changes. A temple priest might be deeply immersed in Egyptian ritual traditions, even as official paperwork and taxation systems reflect new administrative norms. There is no single experience of being Egyptian in this period. It depends on where you stand, what work you do, what gods you serve, what language you speak at home and in public. And then the story reaches another turning point, widely remembered and often overlit by later storytelling: Cleopatra VII. In established history, Cleopatra VII's era ends with Roman annexation. Egypt becomes a crucial province in the Roman world. We do not need to dwell on dramatic details here. What matters is the result. Egypt, long a kingdom in its own right, becomes part of Rome's vast system. Its grain becomes essential. Its wealth becomes administrative. Its land is valued not only for its temples and traditions, but for what it can supply to an empire that spans the Mediterranean. And yet, even after annexation, even after the title Pharaoh begins to shift in meaning, the old temples continue. Traditional temples continue functioning for centuries, even as religious landscapes change over time. This is one of the most quietly striking continuities. The rituals do not simply stop because political sovereignty changes. The gods are still approached, offerings are still made, festivals still unfold, priests still wake before dawn to wash, dress statues, burn incense, recite words that have been spoken for generations. Here, the human lens brings us to Philae. A priest stands at dawn, the air cool on his skin. The river nearby is pale with early light. He performs familiar gestures in a world filled with new languages and new rulers. This is not speculation. It is a grounded image consistent with the fact that temple life persisted. He knows the old sequences, the purification, the arrangement of offerings, the careful movement through corridors and chambers where the divine presence is believed to gather. Outside the temple, the world has learned new names for power. Inside, the gestures remain the same. We can imagine the priest's hands repeating motions taught by elders, not hurried, not uncertain, but steady. Perhaps the words are spoken in a tongue whose sacred use stretches back into deep time. Perhaps the temple walls bear reliefs carved not so long ago, in Ptolemaic or Roman periods, yet shaped to look ancient. Pharaoh-like figures offering to gods in scenes that could almost belong to an earlier millennium. In such a place, time feels layered too, not linear but stacked, past holding up present. And then we return to Alexandria, to the harbour again. A dock worker stands among crates and ropes, hearing debate from passing scholars, voices discussing ideas that travel across seas. He may catch fragments, talk of philosophy, mathematics, poetry, law. He hears names that mean little to him, or perhaps he repeats them later in a tavern for the pleasure of sounding educated. But then he returns to the simple math of ropes, crates, and tides. This is an established kind of human reality. Most people live within practical rhythms, even when surrounded by intellectual and cultural change. The dock worker knows what matters for his day, how heavy the load is, how quickly the tide turns, whether the wind will shift. The harbour's lights are beautiful, yes, but beauty does not replace bread. In this era, our evidence often comes from documents as well as stone. Documentary papyri from Greco-Roman Egypt preserve glimpses of ordinary transactions, contracts, petitions, accounts, letters. They are not poetic in the way temple reliefs are. They are blunt, practical, sometimes weary. They remind us that life continues in details, taxes owed, land leased, disputes brought before officials, goods sold and counted. Stone gives us the sacred and the monumental. Papyrus gives us the everyday. And between them, Egypt lives on, changed, adapting, yet still recognizable in the way the Nile binds the valley together. If there is a feeling of ending here, it is not the sudden extinguishing of a flame. It is a gradual shift in what the flame illuminates. Over time, religious landscapes change, new forms of worship spread. Old gods remain in some places longer than in others. In temples like Philae, rituals endure for centuries until eventually the sacred world that once anchored Egypt begins to quiet. But even then the stones remain, the pylons still face the sky. The river still moves past them, the desert still presses close, patient as ever. Alexandria's harbour continues to glitter and fade with night winds. People continue to live among layers of language, law and belief. And perhaps that is why this chapter feels like a long goodbye rather than a clean end. Because endings in human history rarely arrive all at once. They seep in like dusk. They arrive in administrative changes, in new titles, in new prayers spoken beside old ones. They arrive when a priest realizes he is one of fewer voices still speaking the ancient words. They arrive when a child grows up hearing different stories as normal, while elders remember another world. And still, the Nile runs. The same river that carried predynastic boats, that reflected pyramids, that flowed past Amarna's bright emptiness, that watched Ramesside monuments rise, now carries ships under Roman rule. It does not choose sides. It does not speak. It simply continues, as if reminding every era that the deepest forces move beneath names and crowns. When the old gods are still worshipped, but the world has learned new names. What exactly is ending? A modern museum gallery, quiet as a chapel. The air is cool and still. Footsteps soften themselves on the floor as if the room is asking for gentleness. Glass cases glow with a steady, careful light, neither bright nor dim, but measured, like twilight held in place. Behind the glass, stone faces stare past us. Calm, unreadable, unhurried. Their expressions do not plead for attention. They do not explain themselves. They simply endure, and in their endurance they make the present feel briefly smaller. In such a room, time does something strange. It does not march forward. It pools. A carved head from a temple wall sits only inches from a modern hand. A funerary figurine stands upright under museum lighting, still poised for duties meant for an afterlife. A fragment of painted plaster carries the faint trace of a blue sky that was imagined thousands of years ago. And in the hush, it becomes easy to feel that Egypt is both very far away and very close, distant as a star, near as a breath. Much of what we know comes from archaeology, inscriptions and texts, unevenly preserved, often filtered through elite contexts and later collectors. This is the quiet discipline beneath the dream. What survives is not what was most common. Stone lasts. Gold lasts. Monument and tomb last. Meanwhile, the ordinary house collapses back into earth. The daily voice, spoken in courtyards, along canals and fields, vanishes unless it is caught by accident in some durable form. So the Egypt we meet in museums and in books often wears the clothing of power. Kings, priests, tomb owners, temple builders. And yet, if we listen closely, we sometimes hear the softer echoes too. Notes on papyrus, scratches on pottery, a ration list, a complaint, a small prayer. Not enough to reconstruct every life, but enough to remind us that the civilization's true body was made of countless ordinary days. Here is the work of archaeology, to approach those days without pretending we can fully recover them. Picture an excavator. An excavator brushes dust from a shard, patient work that turns fragments into timelines. The gesture is small and almost tender. Dust lifts away in pale clouds. A line appears, incised, painted, written, or simply shaped by a hand that once held wet clay. The shard itself may be broken beyond recognition of its original vessel, but it carries a kind of stubborn testimony. Someone made this. Someone used it. Someone lived near it. So much of history is this. Not a grand revelation, but a slow accumulation of careful attention. And then, in the modern era, another kind of attention changes everything. The decipherment of hieroglyphs transforms Egypt from a dream of symbols into a place of readable voices and records. Before that transformation, temples and tombs were filled with signs that looked beautiful and mysterious, but remained silent to most readers. Afterwards, the walls begin to speak in a new way, not with invented romance, but with names, titles, prayers, and records that can be traced and compared. Egypt becomes, in part, legible, no longer only seen, but read. The Rosetta Stone stands as a key artifact type in that story, a bridge between languages that helped unlock the code. Alongside it, curated museum collections and excavation archives become modern memory rooms, holding fragments gathered from many places into new kinds of order, catalogued, protected, studied, displayed. But a memory room is never neutral. Here we step gently into interpretation. Every generation rereads Egypt, sometimes seeking grandeur, sometimes seeking wisdom, sometimes projecting fantasies. Some look for the majesty of pyramids and the certainty of kingship. Some look for spiritual depth, for hints of an older understanding of death and eternity. Some look for mysteries where the evidence offers only patient, incomplete answers. And sometimes, without meaning to, we use Egypt as a mirror, seeing in it what we wish to see in ourselves. Yet Egypt has always resisted being fully possessed by anyone's story. Even in its own time, it was not a single voice. It was many voices gathered along one river. It was the temple hymn and the field worker's fatigue, the royal inscription and the household whisper, the monumental certainty of stone and the fragile, perishable truth of daily bread. And now, standing in the museum's quiet, we sense the limits again. Glass protects the object, but it also places distance between us and the life that once touched it. A label can tell us a dynasty and a site, but it cannot restore the warmth of a hand, the smell of the river at dawn, the moment a craftsman set down a tool and went home. Still, wonder remains. The Nile still runs, and the desert still keeps its silence, holding stories we haven't learned to ask for yet. The river does not care what we call it, but it continues to carry silt and light, continuing the rhythm that made this civilization possible. The desert does not explain itself, but it preserves and erases with the same indifferent patience. Somewhere beyond the museum walls, beyond the archives and shelves, the landscape that shaped Egypt still exists in its essential forms: water, wind, stone, sky. And perhaps that is why Egypt stays with people, not only because of what it built, but because it invites a particular kind of listening. A listening that accepts gaps. A listening that understands that the past is not a room we can step into whole, but a shoreline where fragments wash up, each one asking for care, not conquest. As the museum lights dim toward closing time, the glass cases keep their soft glow a little longer. Visitors drift away. The stone faces remain. Their calm expressions do not change. They stare past us, beyond us, as if their attention rests on something larger than any single era. And somewhere, if you imagine it, the river moves through the night again, black water carrying a strip of moonlight, reeds whispering, desert holding its breath. As the river's name echoes in your mind, what part of Egypt is still alive? Stone, story, or the listening?